The Mountain Lion by Gene Stafford. Chapter 5. On a winter Sunday afternoon, when Ralph was 14, the Follansbys had come to call, and he and Molly were sitting in their Sunday clothes and Sunday solemnity on the hassock in the bay window. Looking at the portrait of his grandfather Bonnie, Ralph read into his face vacuity and self-pride. He saw the plump hands as indolent and useless, and believed that in a hand-clasp they would be flaccid. He understood now why Grandpa Kenyon, when he had used the word merchant, had uttered it like a curse. He decided that the world was made up of two groups of people. The first he called Kenyon men, and this included those who, like Uncle Claude, knew the habits of animals and subjected themselves to the government of the seasons, and who, with age, became neither fat and bald like Grandfather Bonnie, nor bony and ragged like Mr. Follansby. The other group he called Bonnie merchants, and this included everyone he had ever known, with the exception of the people at the Barquet, Grandpa, and Molly. The fundamental distinction between the two groups was, he thought, their attitude toward horses, and vice versa, the attitude of horses toward them. For 4 years now, Ralph and Molly had divided their year between the men and the merchants. Their lives were like those of the children of divorced parents, who spend a season of each year with their father, and the bulk of it with their mother, and who feel themselves thus split in half, and sometimes find their memories confused, so that they cannot be sure what books have been read, which ideas acquired, which sounds and shapes perceived in the two separate households. Their own relationship was likewise a double one. At the ranch, they all but ignored one another, but in Covina, alone with their mother now that Leah and Rachel were away at boarding school, they were still close friends. Their estrangement at the ranch had begun on a day late in August in the very first summer they went to Uncle Claude's, a day on which Ralph's whole life had been changed. Uncle Claude had taken him and Molly and Winifred up to the nearest of the glaciers. They went horseback as far as they could, a little below timberline, then hobbled the horses at an abandoned mine, and climbed the rest of the way. Uncle Claude's clowning Newfoundland, Walter, charged into every pool they came to, and slunk out, shuddering and coughing. Claude and Winifred were skilled and tireless mountaineers, and the two of them went straight up without stopping, leaving Ralph and Molly far behind. When the children finally got to the top, weary, cold, hungry, and exasperated, they almost cried to see that the others had not waited for them there, but had gone on and had climbed a cluster of rocks nearby. They were sitting on the topmost one, side by side, and they laughed down and waved, turning then to one another to say something the children could not hear. Ralph was too depressed and too tired to take any interest in the vast slide of ice to which he had been looking forward for weeks, nor in the strawberry snow at the head of the glacier. Warm with resentment of Uncle Claude's desertion, he glanced around him casually, and then joined Molly, who had begun to pluck the waxy yellow orchids growing profusely there, for they had promised to take a bouquet to Mrs. Brotherman. Actually, he was less angry than perplexed, for he did not understand why Uncle Claude should prefer the company of a girl to his, nor, on the other hand, why Winifred should desert a child for a grown-up. Suddenly it occurred to him, stunning him, that Winifred was really not a child, but was as old as Leah. This realization made him feel colder and tireder than ever, and he would have lain down amongst the flowers if this would have not appeared an act of weakness to the sitters on the rock. He looked at his weedy sister with dislike as she crouched on her heels, plucking the lilies all around her, and when she looked up at him, her large, humble eyes fondling his face with lonely love, he wanted to cry out with despair, because hers was really the only love he had, and he found it nothing but a burden and a tribulation. She kept a diary in which she recorded everything he said and everything he did, and she insisted on reading each entry to him before they went to bed. At first he had been flattered, but now he was only embarrassed. She was especially rhetorical on the subject of his shooting, at which, if the truth were known, he was quite inferior. Molly would not learn to shoot, and she did not like to touch a gun, even when it was unloaded, for their mother had frequently warned them that it was the unloaded ones that always went off. But she went on about Ralph's handling of his .22, under the tutelage of Winifred, as if he were a champion. His first game was only a portly pack rat, which had got into the potato cellar on the side of the hill, but later on he shot 2 jackrabbits and a sage hen. Molly wrote in her diary that he had shot 3 Rocky Mountain laughing hyenas. For the most part, she did not pester him much, but hung around Winifred, on whom she had a crush. But he was always conscious of her, always nagged by the suspicion that she felt left out. Half the time, though, it was he who felt left out, like right now when Winifred had stolen Uncle Claude. Later, after they had eaten their lunches of salmon sandwiches and baby Ruths, Uncle Claude offered to let Ralph look through his binoculars to see if he could spot any automobiles on Cuthbert Pass. And when he took off his glasses, Uncle Claude said, "Why don't you leave them things off all the time?" And Ralph obeyed. He began by not wearing his glasses for an hour at a time, and then for 2 hours, and then for whole days, except when he went out to shoot. It caused him at first to have hammering headaches, and they, in turn, made him eventually vomit, and then writhe miserably on the settle in Mrs. Brotherman's sitting room with a damp washcloth over his forehead. But he persisted, and within a few weeks his headaches came infrequently, and he was able to see almost as well as he had done with his glasses. Molly tried it too, but in vain. Her eyes were much worse than his, and without her glasses she was as blind as a mole. After that, everything happened. For example, Uncle Claude took him one day to a deep, wet-weather branch where a cow was calving, and at that moment he saw the horrible little hoof appear. He felt a painful exultation, and he tried to remember what Mysol and Mysako had said that day in the watermelon patch. He was not in the least embarrassed, only filled with wonder at the bewildered, wet calf that was finally born, and immediately stood up, although it was so small and weak it swayed piteously under its mother's big rosy tongue. But when he told Molly about it, she stuck her fingers in her ears and screamed at him, "You're a liar, you're a dirty liar," and her nose began to bleed. And Uncle Claude always let him help with the butchering when he was doing it himself. He would shoot the steer through the skull, and then would fling his pistol to the ground and run to slit the creature's throat. He stood back after that while the blood gushed out and waited until the reflexes stopped and the dainty legs ceased kicking. Most of the process was sickening, but there was one part he liked, and this was the skinning of the carcass after it was strung up. The tight hide came off like an eggshell under his sharp knife, and he was always surprised that there was no blood at all, and that when the hide was off, nothing showed but another skin of white fat. It looked like someone in winter underwear. He turned his head aside when Uncle Claude commenced to draw it, for the blue guts were hot and steamy, and as they slithered out they stank like a backhouse. Sometimes, by accident, the knife went into the stomach, and then green grass came bulging out, fetid and slimy, like the stuff around the stems of zinnias that had been too long in water. Ralph carried the tongue and the liver in a pail to the kitchen, and the bloodthirsty old Negro woman looked on them as greedily as a scavenger bird. For 4 summers now, Ralph had been his uncle's constant companion. Occasionally they went into town in the early evening to visit one of Uncle Claude's friends. They would sit around the kitchen table drinking iced tea, or sometimes homebrew. Ralph had Coca-Cola or Orange Crush, which Uncle Claude would buy at the drugstore on the way. They talked of murders, of hunting, of horses, of dudes. Some nights, though, Uncle Claude went in alone, not telling anyone what he was going to do. And deeply and secretly Ralph suspected that he was going to a particular street whose nature he would not allow himself to imagine. It was a street 1 block long, and on either side of it were small, white, one-room houses. At the end of the block there was a larger house, made of red brick, where lived a woman named Dago Mary, who one day had called out to Ralph as he was hurrying by at dusk to meet Uncle Claude at the post office, and had asked him to run down to the drugstore to get her a package of Luckies and an ammonia Coke. He had not even refused, he had run on, his heart pounding. Often on those nights when Uncle Claude had set forth mysteriously, Ralph thought of how, before he had seen the birth of the calf, he had been like Molly, savagely refusing the knowledge of such things. But now, bad as he knew it all to be, it sometimes gave him a warm feeling like cocoa on a cold night. Winifred did not like him, and he did not know why. In the very first year he had tried to win her by praise, by telling her jokes, by teaching her Boy Scout knots, but she was always aloof with him. And then one day they had a real falling out. They had gone hunting, and he had shot a prairie dog, but she had not hit anything. They sat down to rest on a knoll near the river, and Ralph, on an impulse, asked her if she had ever heard about the time Grandpa Kenyon had killed a man. He had assumed, in his possessiveness of Grandpa, that she would not possibly know, and his question was rhetorical, holding the expectation of her astonishment and eagerness to hear the story. He even forgot for a moment that Molly knew, and that Leah and Rachel and the Follansbys did. He felt that he was offering Winifred a new and precious gift, so that he was completely taken aback when she said she had known it before Ralph was dry behind the ears. She spoke with such ferocity that he blushed deeply. Molly turned on Winifred enraged. "He was not your grandfather, he was ours." Winifred jumped up, her eyes blazing, and she said, "He was as much mine as he was yours. He wasn't any kin to you, you dirty little snobs." Recalling this now, as he looked at the portrait, he wondered if there were not some kind of operation you could have to drain off the bonny blood in you. You could then have a transfusion from Uncle Claude. The terrible danger was that he might get fat like his mother. It was awful that she had named him for Grandfather Bonnie, and that she kept saying all the time that she wanted him to be exactly like him when he grew up. Sometimes he really hated her, just as he had moments of intense hatred for Mr. Follansby, when, listening to the sermon, he knew that he did not believe in God. Especially he hated his mother when he hurt her feelings and she cried. The tears did not move him, nor was he taken in when she blubbered that he was all she had left in the world. But he could not bear the display, her pretty face becoming dropsical and red, and she made piping noises like a fretful kitten. She was a bonny merchant, through and through. Ralph handled the symbols of his life delicately, like superstitions. Round Grandfather Bonnie's portrait and urn he walked with care lest he arouse his ghost, and when, on the anniversary of Grandpa Kenyon's death, he went with his sister and his mother to lay flowers on the gravestone, fixed his attention on the impersonal junipers that hugged the slopes of the low mound, and refused himself the memory either of the living man or of the corpse in the parlor. For he believed that if he did not allow even his most hidden mind to prefer one dead man above the other, Grandfather Bonnie would not creep forth to haunt and discolor his days at Uncle Claude's, where his whole existence betrayed his mother. She knew, to be sure, that he rode and shot and was around dangerous machinery, and she cried a good deal over this, and there was always a wretched scene in Denver when she saw them off on the train to the Barquet. But she was secretly glad to be rid of her volatile two in the summer, and to bask in the sunny dispositions and pretty faces of her two older children. Today, in the damp twilight, Ralph seemed unable to escape the man in the portrait, and he was filled with a terrible physical disgust. Momentarily he closed his eyes and allowed the voices to seep into his mind. His mother was speaking of him, and she was saying, "You know, Mr. Follansby, the single disappointment in my father's life was that he had not studied law at Harvard. It is my dearest wish that Ralph will." Mr. Follansby, who had a digestive condition, belched slightly and perfunctorily sought pardon. He said, "An excellent plan, Rose. And how about it, Sonny? How do you feel?" He did not expect an answer. He was a rhetorician and cared little for give and take. He made a speech as if he were in the pulpit, scattering Latin phrases where they fell, and bringing in such subsidiary matters as a friend named Dr. Lucius Kennedy, who lived in Somerville, a felicitous conversation he had held with a Mr. James Brooks on the bench in the Boston Common, and a Pasadena lawyer of high reputation who had been discovered recently to be the owner of a still in the neighborhood of Carson City. He concluded, addressing Ralph directly, that it would be an ungrateful son who did not grant his mother's dearest wish. He pointed to the portrait and said, "Emulate him, my boy, for he was a man among men, a man whose motto was the single word, honesty." Ever since the scene in this room on the day of Grandpa's funeral, Mr. Follansby had been spitefully on the lookout for ways to nettle him and Molly. He would refer obliquely to Tall Tales, to Paul Bunyan and Baron von Munchausen, and, pinching Molly's sallow cheek, would say, "Hello, hello, my pretty little fairy. Take care you don't fly away." Now he spoke of the fine blood that ran in Ralph's veins. It was as if he had read his mind, and went on to speak of the love that bound a son to his mother. Ralph's embarrassment, the preacher ruthlessly kept his eye upon him, was so febrile and agitated that he could not keep his feet and hands still, and they danced foolishly. He tried in vain to envisage Uncle Claude, but could see in his mind's eye nothing but his mother, bending over him anxiously as he lay sick of scarlet fever, the neck of her gray silk blouse open so that her breasts showed. And then, once, her image was replaced by that of Grandfather Bonnie, Tennyson, and President Cleveland plodding arm in arm toward the sandbar. When Mr. Follansby had paused, Mrs. Fawcett said, "I know many things may happen in these years before he is ready to go to college, but I do not feel that anyone has ever suffered by taking the longer view of things. Besides, it is not much more than 2 years. When the time comes, I will sell this place, and we will go east to live." "Not me," said Molly. Mrs. Fawcett smiled. "Molly doesn't want to do anything anyone else does." "The rugged individualist," said Mr. Follansby with a chuckle. "Well, Molly, what do you want to do?" It was, Ralph knew, all she could do to keep from sticking out her tongue. "I want to stay here with Grandpa," she said. They were all shocked. The depths of this child were unfathomable, and Mrs. Fawcett at times was really afraid of her. Somehow time did not soften her, did not make her have thoughts and feelings like the other children. Now Ralph, although he was still unusually sensitive and in some ways eccentric, had normal interests, much as she wished the object of his admiration had been someone of more culture and refinement than Claude Kenyon. Mrs. Fawcett was bound to admit that it was right for him to enjoy the company of a grown man. And, moreover, he was beginning to look, well, to put it bluntly, to look like a human being. But poor Molly, although she had shot up and was taller than any of her schoolmates, looked just the same as she had done when she was 8. And the things she said... Mrs. Fawcett faltered, "Molly, dear, you mustn't say things that make us sad." Molly stared at her and curled her lip. Mrs. Follansby rescued them, asking in her domestic voice what sort of house Mrs. Fawcett would buy in the East. She said she would settle somewhere in Connecticut near Aunt Rowena, and that in the winter she would rent a house in Cambridge so that Ralph would not have to lead the irregular life of the dormitories. It was planned, parenthetically, that Molly would go to a boarding school in the vicinity of Boston, and then would go either to Radcliffe or to Wellesley. Mrs. Fawcett said, "I should like one of my daughters to be a college woman, and the other 2 give me no hope. They write of nothing but beaux." It was time for tea, and Mrs. Fawcett rose to wheel in the table from the dining room. As she passed her son, she stooped and kissed the top of his head, and with a small, sweet-smelling hand, patted his cheek. And then, as a sop to her conscience, she ran her fingers through Molly's hair. The preacher and his wife smiled benignly on the scene, exchanged the sorrowful glances of the childless, and the man belched. The woman sighed. In the few minutes that Mrs. Fawcett was gone from the room, the Follansbys changed their pious, general tone, and inquired of Molly and Ralph lightly and condescendingly, Mrs. Follansby speaking in a very loud voice, whether they did not keenly look forward to going to college. Molly said, "We're not going to college, neither one of us, and we decided that before you were born." Mr. Follansby humorously clucked his tongue. "And what do you Methuselahs intend to do?" She said, "We will get married and stay right here with Grandpa." And then she turned to her brother and said, "Won't we?" She would never believe him when he told her that marriage was not what she thought it was. The first summer at the ranch, she had wanted to marry Studebaker, and a long time ago she had told everyone at school that she was engaged to Schonesund. The Follansbys looked at her with horror, and Ralph whispered in her ear, "Don't say anything more, I'll tell you why later." There was always a long, uncomfortable pause when the water was coming to a boil over the spirit lamp, and no one seemed to be able to think of anything to say. Today, as always, there was an expectant hush, and Mr. Follansby's stomach made a noise like a querulous voice. Disgust overwhelmed Ralph. Would they never take their awful bonny bodies away? He took a drink of his tea and said, "The milk is sour, Mother." "Nonsense," she replied. "I poured it into the pitcher myself. Mr. Vogelman brought it this morning." He drank again and repeated, "It's sour, I say." Sour spit flowed from behind his jaws into his mouth, and he swallowed desperately. He tried to think of something else, but he could think only of milk and its smell. Shaking like an old man, he returned his cup to the tea wagon and said, "May I be excused? I am going to be sick." "The milk is fresh," insisted his mother. "Sit down, son. It is very rude to behave this way." "My brother will be sick," said Molly, dully, stating a fact. He put both hands over his mouth and ran to the door. His illness lay in small pools of froth on the carpet and all the way up the stairs to the bathroom. When he had finished being sick, he went to his room and lay down on the bed with his eyes open, watching the green sky darken and the rosy clouds divide, assume new shapes, then disappear from sight. He did not know what had happened to benumb him in this way, and he knew that the milk had not been sour. But he felt as disabled as he had done when his tonsils were removed and the ether mask had been fitted over his nose. He had never forgotten the blue, spicy smell. Now, 6 years later, he could remember it accurately, and he gagged again. He could take no pleasure in thinking of the Barquet. Next summer would bring him closer to the end of these summers, nearer to New England, a cloudy abstraction no more imaginable than the world of sleep. He knew that his mother would not let him go back once she had settled in Connecticut. He could not bear the thought of not seeing Uncle Claude again, and the ranch itself and the mountains, which both he and Molly loved as if they owned them. Sometimes he went swimming naked in the cold, amber pool of the caribou behind the barn. How long ago it seemed that he and Molly had been horrified when Winifred had said she was going in without her suit. Alone in this rustling, humming wilderness, he pretended that he was an Indian. Later, coming back to the house, he paused on the ridge to the west of the barn, and surveying the buildings and the pastures, he imagined himself as Uncle Claude's partner, saw himself riding in a caboose to Mexico with carloads of stock in front of him, saw their consultations in the office on what to buy and what to sell. In time, growing taller and filling out, people would take him for Kenyon's brother, Grandpa's younger son. Often he went climbing with Molly and Winifred. They hunted for beaver dams, filling their pockets for no reason at all with the chips of wood that littered the ground around the fallen trees. They found sweet pinyon seeds which covered their hands with pitch that smelled like medicine. Winifred had taught them how to climb without getting winded and to go up the chimneys of the pinnacled red rocks, their hands on either wall, their rubber-soled shoes squealing at their pressure against the narrow footholds. Each time they went into the mountains, something unusual happened. They would come upon a ranger's saddled horse, cropping in a field of columbine, an old man panning for gold in a stream. Once they found an empty whiskey bottle, covered over with pine needles, in a place so far from everything that they could not imagine what sort of person had put it there. From a favorite cliff they looked down into the valley and could see the pretentious dude camp west of Uncle Claude's set in a barren waste of scrub oak and sage. A cattle train, puffing out a clean-lined cloud of white smoke, burrowed through the red banks like a mole, disappeared, and sent back a faint, protesting valedictory. There was always the possibility that they might see a mountain lion. They never did, but often they saw eagles. The very life would be crushed out of him if he were deprived of all this. Of late he had been wild with all sorts of angers, and with an anxiety which he could not name, but which pestered him continually, so that he could not keep his mind on reading, and sometimes he could not even pay attention to the movies. Sometimes he loathed his physical being for the alterations that were taking place in it. When his voice cracked, he wanted to die of shame. And when Molly laughed at him, he was abjectly humiliated. He was filling out now. He had lost his pallor, and his eyes, quite strong, were clear. He would have taken pleasure in his appearance if it were not for Molly with her ugly face and her lankiness and the slouching, round-shouldered gait which she had developed, and which caused her enemies to call her the Crab. There was something wrong with her, and while he still loved her, he wished oftener and oftener that she did not exist. The sky darkened suddenly, and in a few minutes it began to rain. The calm sound of it in the turquoise berries outside his window soothed him. He lay as still as a stone. He thought, there was something preying on Grandpa Kenyon's mind that day. Perhaps he knew he was going to die, and that was why he had been absent-mindedly tapping the turquoise berry with his shillelagh. That was the sort of meaningless thing you did when you had a great worry. As soon as Ralph left the room, Molly returned her cup to the tea wagon and said, "If you will pardon me, this is the pause in the day's occupation which is known as the children's hour." Mrs. Fawcett shook her head and sighed. She's simply not happy unless she can be with Ralph. If he's asleep, don't wake him. Mr. and Mrs. Follansby said goodbye, Molly, and Molly said, so long, so that she had to come back and curtsy and say it properly. She stepped around Ralph's sickness, which the grown-ups had chosen to ignore. It was just spit, and it was already sinking into the carpet. She had no intention of going to Ralph's room. It had been perfectly clear that he was not going to marry her, and she suspected that he was going to marry Uncle Claude. She went down the hall to the kitchen. It wore its Sunday afternoon look of lifeless cleanliness. Fuchsia did not prepare their supper on Sunday night, but left a pot of soup to bubble slowly on the back of the stove. This was all they had except toast and peanut butter and a chocolate drop apiece. The funny papers were on top of the refrigerator, and she read Out Our Way. It was very funny today. The two kids and their father were out cleaning the backyard and getting terribly dirty. They had to pass the living room door to get upstairs to the bathroom to wash, and the mother was having company. So they took a sheet off the line, and the father said they would all get under it, and it would just look like a white flash going past the door. But it didn't work because they got mixed up and went in the door instead of past it. She laughed for a moment, and then, looking in the mirror over the sink, she said, scarcely moving her lips, "Ha ha, tee-hee." Molly let herself out the back door without a sound. Budge, who was now old and insensate, lay on the top step, unmindful of the rain, but she did no more than look at her and murmur, "Hi, Purcat." She went to the shed where the bleaching vats stood ready for the next year's harvest. There was a chemical smell here, and this, together with the murkiness and the drizzle against the window panes, made her think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and she proceeded as if she were walking in her sleep. She went directly to the beakers of acid on their racks, which Miguel had warned her and Ralph against since they were tiny children, pulling out their stoppers to show the sour blue vapor emerging from the hidden heat. One drop of it, he said, on the bare skin would hurt like a red-hot poker, and he put an eyedropper of it on an old piece of canvas to show them how quickly it would eat through any substance. Miguel had taken a correspondence course in chemistry, and the shed looked almost like a laboratory with test tubes everywhere, stained purple and green and bile color. There was a Bunsen burner and a collection of beakers of bizarre and attractive shapes. He experimented with all kinds of things. Once he had let Molly and Ralph watch when he combined his spit with something and it turned bright green. Ralph asked him if the acid would burn off warts, but Miguel said no. There was a test tube marked H2SO4, which Molly knew was the most dangerous of them all. That was what they used to make the walnuts pale. She took the small, flat cork out and smelled the nasty smell. Then she held her left hand over a basin and poured the contents on it. At first it did not hurt at all. It stung a little, like the liquid soap in the basement at school. But that same blue smoke came up from her hand, and almost at once big, puffy blisters came out as white and opaque as mushrooms, and there was a new and terrible smell. The smell, not the blisters, alarmed her, and sent her plunging to the sink, where there was a cold water tap. But the more water she allowed to flow over her hand, the bigger the blisters got, and when she took her hand away and sniffed at it, the smell was worse than ever. Then she began to cry, not with pain, but with terror at this odor of her destruction, and she stood in despair in the shadowy room full of the sound of rain. She ran out of the shed as if she were being chased and back through the kitchen, sobbing, "Mother, Mother, I have hurt myself." Ralph was in the kitchen cutting himself a piece of raisin bread, so she knew he had not been very sick, and when he heard her he stumbled out, dropping the knife onto the floor. "Look," she moaned, "look what happened to me." The pain was not severe. It was the knowledge that the acid was eating her, the way Fallen's bees were eating cake, the way Ralph had been about to eat the raisin bread, and in this revulsion she paid no attention to her brother, who was saying, "What is it, Molly? What did you do?" She sat down at the table and put her head on her right arm and stretched out her left arm in front of her, so that Ralph could look at the burn, and she wept with pity. Ralph stared and impatiently repeated, "What is it?" until finally she was able to say, "Miguel's acid." And then he went crying along the corridor to the parlor as she lifted up her head and screamed, "Help! Help!" Molly lay on the lounge in her father's den and refused to answer any of their questions. Through her half-open eyes she saw them standing in a row beside her. Her mother was wearing a pink dress with an accordion-pleated skirt, and her cheeks were as pink as the cloth with passion as she insisted, "Tell Mother, my baby, Mother is not cross with her little girl." But Molly knew that this was a lie, for she heard the anger in her voice as clearly as she saw it in Mr. Follensby's eyes, which were green like the cases of fish in the aquarium. He stood at the foot of the lounge, looking from time to time at his watch. He had promised Mrs. Fawcett that he would stay until the doctor came, but he was nervous for fear that he would not have proper time for his supper before Epworth League. Mrs. Follensby, who had declared herself to be chilled to the marrow, sniffed into her handkerchief and often repeated that the best thing in the world for burns was butter. Molly thought, slyly, then the acid would eat the butter. The acid would have a buttered hand sandwich. Ralph stood at the head of the lounge, and she could not see him, but every so often he stroked her forehead and said, "It won't hurt in a little while." At last they heard Dr. Haskell's car on the drive, and Molly said, "I don't want you to stay in here." "Young lady," began Mr. Follansby, but Mrs. Fawcett checked him with a wave of the hand and said, "Yes, sweetheart, if you're sure, you won't be afraid." "Ralph can stay," she said, and Mrs. Fawcett looked at Mr. Follansby and said, "You see?" And then they left the room. Both Molly and Ralph had always been fond of Dr. Haskell, who did not take their mother seriously, and who had a nice angular face and curly red hair. When they had scarlet fever, he brought Molly a brown candy reindeer and Ralph a bear. He drew up a chair and, glancing at Molly's hand, said, "Molly, you give me a pain in the neck. I was just sitting down to my supper, and I was going to have waffles." "I can't stand waffles," said Molly, and Dr. Haskell laughed. "Now tell me what you did this time," he said, picking up her hand and touching the blisters lightly with his fingers. She could have told the truth without embarrassment, that she had done it on purpose to punish Ralph, but while she liked Dr. Haskell, she did not entirely trust him. Once he had told Mrs. Fawcett that she and Ralph were nervous, and their mother was stricter than ever after that, saying, "I think you need a little rest. We don't want to get tired out and then be nervous, do we?" The word nervous came to be as disgusting to her as body. So now, if she told the truth, she had no assurance that Dr. Haskell would not tattle. For that matter, she was no longer even sure of Ralph, and she said, "I went out to the shed to see if I could find my art gum." Ralph said quickly and suspiciously, "Why would it be in the shed?" "I thought maybe Miguel had borrowed it." Now she was disquieted, and her heart beat strongly. "I was looking around there, but it was dark as a pocket, and all of a sudden I knocked over a little bottle of stuff, and it went all over my hand." Dr. Haskell went to the door and called across the hall, asking for a basin of hot water. Coming back, he said, quite matter-of-factly, "And the cork was out of the bottle?" "Yes," said Molly, "yes, it was." The doctor clucked his tongue. "That is very careless of Miguel. We must speak to your mother about it." "Oh, no," she cried. "Oh, please don't. Miguel would knock my block off. It wasn't his fault." The doctor's smiling glance went straight through her, and he said, "This time, then, I won't. But if it should happen again, Molly—" And his smile went off like a streetlight. "What did you do then?" asked Ralph. Molly, remembering the basin where some of the acid would still be lying, remembering the cork which had just been sitting there beside the rack of test tubes, was afraid now, and her hand began to hurt dreadfully. She whimpered, "I put my hand under the water faucet, but it didn't do any good." "I guess not," said Dr. Haskell. Mrs. Fawcett, returning with the basin which steamed into her face, asked, "It isn't serious, is it, doctor? I cannot tell you how often and often I have warned them about the acids." Dr. Haskell said, "It isn't too serious. There is danger of infection, though, if we're not careful." "Infection!" cried Mrs. Fawcett, stumbling from the room, her hand pressed to her bosom, and Molly's heart said, "Goody, goody." For some weeks, it seemed possible that Molly might lose her hand. She wore it upon a cast of paraffin, for Dr. Haskell was afraid that if air got into the wound and a scab formed, the acid would continue to eat its insidious way through the flesh. In time, it began to have so unpleasant a smell that she lay in bed with her arms stretched out, her head tuned to the wall, and a sachet of lavender pinned to her pillow. The pain was never great, but she was obsessed with the horror of being consumed alive. She did not go to school for a few days, and as this was a time of cold rain, she stayed indoors reading Bleak House. It was not like being sick, for she did not have to stay in bed, but could go wherever she liked in the house. Sometimes she sat in the parlor and sometimes in the guest room, but usually she sat in her father's den. People rarely came in there, except to use the telephone, so she would not be bothered in the middle of a paragraph by someone saying, "How do you feel, Molly girl?" or "Would you like some Ovaltine?" People were always looking at her, and she knew none of them believed it was an accident. Ralph hadn't from the beginning, and the night it happened, Ralph came into her room and whispered, "If you have to do dumb things, I don't see why you have to be so dumb about it. I went and got the cork." "I did it to punish you," she said. "What did I do to you?" "You said we were not going to get married and stay here." "Molly," he said irritably, and then, more kindly, "I never said that." But though she asked him every day if they were going to get married, he always somehow changed the subject. She had almost come to the conclusion that she would marry Dr. Haskell. One day Mrs. Fawcett came into the den to sew. She had never done this before, but Molly could tell by the way she frowned as she bent over the buttons that she meant to tell her something of importance. Molly glanced at her from time to time over her book. "Molly," she said at last, "what do you do at Uncle Claude's all the time? Do you play with other children your age?" "Of course not," said Molly. "What do you think he lives in, a town? But what do you do?" "I swim, I hike, I ride eye-opener, I talk to Magdalene." "Magdalene? Oh, the cook. I wouldn't talk too much to a darky if I were you, Molly." "You would," thought Molly, "if you were probably a darky yourself and Magdalene's own child." Molly said, "What do you do while we're gone?" "Why, just what we always do," said Mrs. Fawcett with surprise. "Do you know, Molly, I sometimes think you and Ralph are happier with your uncle than you are at home." "I do not believe in happiness," said Molly. Mrs. Fawcett bit her lip. "That is a very foolish thing to say. You are a very foolish girl, Molly." She had something up her sleeve. She said 2 mysterious things. She said, "Well, I used to think it was wrong to let you go, but now I think it's a very good place for you at your age. There must be lots of cunning little calves and lambs and colts and so forth." Molly did not know what her age had to do with it. The colts and lambs and calves were a lot younger than she was. And the other thing was, "I hope you don't try to tag along with Ralph too much." Molly replied with falsehood, "I am with him every minute, every day, every week, every month." They did not talk for a while, and Molly went on reading about the man who went up in spontaneous combustion from drinking too much gin. Shortly before the school bus came, Mrs. Fawcett let the cat out of the bag. She said, "Molly, I wonder if you and Ralph wouldn't like to spend a whole year with Uncle Claude?" "Why?" said Molly. She was not at all sure she would like to spend a whole year at the ranch. The public library was too far away, for one thing. "I just wondered because, well, Molly, I may as well tell you. Now, I don't want you to be disappointed because your turn will come. I'm going to take Leah and Rachel around the world." "When?" said Molly tensely, closing her book. "As soon as Ralph has finished school, this spring." Leah had finished the year before, but she was staying with Aunt Rowena so that she could enjoy the cultural opportunities of New York. Molly, thinking of the pictures in her geography book of the Taj Mahal and the pyramids and the Rock of Gibraltar, which her sappy sisters would get to see, threw Bleak House on the floor and stamped both her feet. "See if I care," she howled. "You just wait till I tell Ralph." "There, there," said your mother. "Don't fuss, Molly. Didn't I say your time would come?" "I'll be too old by then." "Would you like to go to a boarding school instead of to Uncle Claude's?" "No, I want to stay here if I can't go around the world." "But you can't, Molly dear," said Mrs. Fawcett nervously, "because the house will be sold." She had done all this behind their backs. She wasn't content to make the far future look horrible. She had to make it start right away. Molly stared at her bandaged hand, in which now and again there was a slow pain. Dr. Haskell said she was out of danger now, and she was glad that she was not going to lose her hand, but she was also glad that the burn would leave a bad scar. Her mother was going on, talking about how necessary it was for her to take the girls around the world, because she did not belong to a society to which she could present them. This was a substitute, to be sure, but she felt a very satisfactory one. As for Ralph and Molly, she thought the year in the mountains would be very character-building, and she was pleased with Molly's wisdom in not wanting to go to boarding school. In public school, one learned a great deal about responsibility and democracy. Fortunately, Leah and Rachel had sterling characters and had not become snobs. All the same, she realized now that sending them to so fashionable a school had been a dangerous experiment. "But, Molly, dear, before we go, I want to have a long talk with you about a few things." "About what? Go ahead, shoot." "Not now, not yet. Goodness, Ralph is late. The roads must be bad." She put her sewing away and got up. As she left the room, she said, "We're having your favorite dessert for dinner tonight. Lemon pie." When April came, and Molly looked at the spring in Covina for the last time, she was as homesick as if she were only remembering the sweet orange blossoms in the Freudenberg's grove, the palm trees, the bee-filled lipulawn, the workmen with their doe-like eyes. She visited both the graves of her father and of Grandpa Kenyon, and she sat for hours in the shade of a blooming tulip tree in the cemetery. She was restless when she thought of strange children lying under her umbrella tree and strange women cracking the walnuts. Now and again, her careworn melancholy made her suddenly self-contemptuous, and she brushed it off like a spider. Once, to prove to herself that she was not a crybaby, She took a still, live wood mouse from a trap and drowned it in a milk bottle half full of water, rejoicing brutishly in the swimming and the squealing, which became slower and fainter, and at last ceased, while the small, speckled body swelled, and the sharp teeth showed themselves in an angry grin. Ralph was as sad and as jealous as she. They often quarreled. She wondered sometimes if she liked him as well as she used to. Once they were walking home from school together when a girl on a bicycle came riding by. Her name was Ardis Westerlund, and she enjoyed the distinction of having fainted several times in school. She was frail and pretty, and had long yellow hair which was held in place with a round comb. Her mother dressed her to look like Alice. This year she had given Ralph a valentine, and once Molly had seen them earnestly talking together by the parallel bars at recess, and when the bell rang she saw Ralph touch his fingers to his lips and blow Ardis a kiss. Today as she went whizzing by, she cried, "I name Molly for the prettiest girl in school." Both Molly and Ralph halted, and Molly snarled, "Why don't you stop breathing?" But Ardis Westerlund was far away, streaking past the wash. Ralph made a convulsive gesture to take Molly's hand, but she brushed him off and said in a cold, level voice, "I know I'm ugly. I know everyone hates me. I wish I were dead." Unappealing, unloving, she continued to stand motionless in the bright sunshine. She knew the light made even yellower her yellow skin with its hundreds of shining bronze freckles. She could see herself as clearly as if she had looked in a mirror. A blue Indian head jumper hung on her slackly. Her ruffled organdy blouse was mussed and soiled from the long day at school. One knobby knee was covered with a scab from a wound of 2 weeks before. One of the earpieces of her glasses was bound with adhesive tape. Molly was not only ugly, she had a homemade look, a look of having been put together by an inexperienced hand. She closed her eyes and teetered. Ralph shook her. "Come along, Molly, we've got to get home." "I haven't got a home," she said, and she let go her school bag so that its books and pencils and loose-leaf notepaper scattered in the dust at her feet. "Listen, Molly, go away. I wish they had had to cut my hand off." "All right," he cried, and his voice rose to a shout. "All right, why don't you stop breathing?" Molly smiled, a particular smile that always made him crazy mad. He spat at her feet and yelled, "I hate you, damn you, I hate you. Stay here all night for all I care." When he had gone, running down the road, she picked up her books and her papers and wiped the dusty pencils off on her skirt.